Okay, cool. So like I was getting into now, we'll start with questions. And I know, was it Neha, you put in a question, so I'm going to share my screen on that. Oops, not that screen. So I got too many windows. All right. So I'm trying to find it. There it is. Okay, cool. All right, you guys all see office hours doc, right?
Yep.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, let me move you guys'. I got all you guys on my window too, so I can see y'all. All right, cool. So we'll go through some questions first. This might actually be one that we might answer while we're doing the things. So we'll kind of go through that, and then we'll see. I know I put down support vector machines. What else I put down? Ensembles and then pipelines. So we're going to kind of mash those together. We're going to see what you guys want to talk about, since since you guys really, you just tell me what you guys want to talk about, since I'm new here. So, okay, first question, while bagging, they select the samples for replacement. I'm assuming that if our data has 100 samples, 20 kept aside for testing, out of the 80, they would select 80 such that observation repeat. Okay, good. So we're talking about bagging here. I think this might help if we go into bagging. I'll answer this. Otherwise, if we don't go into bagging, I can answer this specifically. Does that sound pretty good? Cool. But does anyone have any questions before we dive into any material? No? Feeling pretty good? Cool. All right. So first things first, I want to share, so all the notebooks I'm going to share with you guys today, I put it in this one repo. And so I'm sending it to you on the Zoom chat, and I'll make sure to put that out on the Slack channel too. But I just put all like my lessons just in one repo, because otherwise I will lose them. I'll forget where they are and everything. So this is just kind of this is how you can kind of find the lessons if you're like, oh, I saw this interesting thing. Like, how do I get back to this? Here, mostly we're going to focus on the machine learning directory here in this repo. And we're going to talk about we'll see what we'll talk about. I do want to talk about pipelines, which is technically section 32, which you guys, would you guys, I'm trying to figure out where you guys are right now. Would you guys already gone through section 32, or is section 32 supposed to be this week? I see a nod.
So I think we stopped at section 30.
Okay, so
section 30, 31, or 32.
James has introduced pipelines. He's kind of been working them into the workflow for the past couple classes.
Perfect. So James is right on top of it, because he's just like me. I'm like, yes, pipelines are super important and so useful that you should learn it before you start looking into the very end. So maybe we can talk about that if you guys would like to kind of go with some specifics. Otherwise, I think when we voted, most people voted for ensembles over support vector machines. Just kind of a quick vote here. Would you guys like to go over ensembles first, or how about 1 for ensembles and then 2 for support vector machines? You can just show your finger, or if your camera's off, if you want to just throw it in the chat. So 1 is for ensembles, right? 2 is for support vector machines. All right, so I think I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, plus let's see what the chat is. So 5 1s as of right now. And then I think I saw less 2s, which kind of comes down to, okay, so let's go through ensembles first, which I think is section 30, right? So we'll talk about this first, which has got a whole bunch of different things. And then if we have time, maybe we'll go over support vector machines a little bit. Sound pretty good? Cool. All right. So pipelines 2, how are we feeling about pipelines? Give me a thumbs up, thumbs down, sideways. How do we feel about using pipelines and stuff? Okay, I see some varied, this is good. All right, I see some thumbs down, sideways, thumbs up. Cool. So, all right, I think I'm going to review a little bit pipelines, because I think it's useful, and it's also super useful to talk about making sure we don't actually, well, we'll talk about like why pipelines are really useful, but one big issue with pipelines is data leakage, which I know for a fact, like I think it was Claude from this cohort. Actually, I remember him asking on a different channel once about pipelines and data leakage and stuff like that. And it was a really good conversation, because it's definitely a big deal. So I think it's useful to go over it, and then that's what will be useful for ensembles and as machine learning thing you do. Okay. All right. So pipelines. So I'm going to go through this a little quickly. You guys tell me if you want me to slow down or go into more detail. All right. So just know, you guys probably already know what pipelines are, but like in general, we talk about pipelines essentially as a way to do a full process. So pipelines are really nice because you can basically make the whole process from like collecting the data all the way through model prediction to like you basically testing your model predictions, stuff like this. And you can build that completely in a pipeline, which is pretty awesome in itself. Now, when we talk about pipelines, usually we mean it as a very general abstract sense, like, oh, we have a pipeline to do these things. But there's actual tools too that can help us build these things. For example, sklearn has a great, amazing pipeline class that can actually build up like these pipelines and makes it really easy to do all the sklearn stuff. But there's some reasons why we want to do that. One is basically, well, some advantage of these pipelines, right? So the reason why we want to do this is that we reduce the complexity. We don't have to kind of like fish around in a notebook and stuff like this. So you can just focus on the parts that you need as you need them and debug them, those individual parts. And what's nice too is like if you already build part of your pipeline, you can literally take part of that, move it over and say, okay, this is now my pipeline. You could have multiple pipelines feed into one. There's some really cool stuff you can do with all that stuff. Okay. The other thing that's very convenient is that basically you can summarize your fine details and steps in the pipeline. So versus searching like, where did I, clean this data? Did I scale it? What scaler did I use? Did I normalize it? Like, what are the different things? You have it much more concisely found. Usually we're talking about like functions and methods that are basically like, oh, we're applying these specific things and you can see them all at once versus like trying to search for like when you change the data. So really, really good stuff. Flexible is that we can basically do what we want and apply it to different models and stuff like that. So we can usually have like the first section of the pipeline, and then we could even have it train multiple models down this pipeline, or just take the pipeline we already have and apply it to this specific model. You guys already do this. If you guys did grid search, give me a thumbs up if you guys implemented grid search at some point. Yeah, grid search basically is doing this for you. You might not realize it, but grid search is actually making multiple models when you run like the grid search classifier in .fit. It's actually making multiple models and comparing multiple for you. So it's a really useful tool, and it's really only available because you have a pipeline to basically feed in basically the beast of the machine of like trying to train it and everything like that. So that's kind of like a really great thing. And the last one is probably like, I think one of the most important reasons of the pipelines, because it prevents mistakes. Basically, like you can do things like by accident and not realize it. And this happens all the time where people have like a method, their process, and they mess up one aspect, but it's hard to find, and they don't realize until after they're all done and they think the results are great, and it turns out it's not great because of something called data leakage. Give me a thumbs up. Does anyone know what data leakage is when I say this term? Good, I see no thumbs up, which is good, it's a new term. So data leakage is a big deal because when we have our training, right, we talk about training our model, right? We wanna make sure when we do our training, we have our train test split, right? You guys are familiar with train test split. Good. Okay. Now, I know the curriculum doesn't necessarily really emphasize this, but I like to really point out this fact is that it's not just a train test, it's also a train validation or dev and test sets. There's actually 3 different parts. Okay. Tell me, does that sound familiar to anyone? Like when I say train validation tests? Yeah. So this is where people go like, wait, what are you talking about? Like, and you guys have kind of been doing this, and that's why it's always really important to kind of review it. So kind of quick thing about like when you do a train test split, you basically have all your data, right? And then you split it up. You guys like have some section of it for training. And then usually we talk about it being the testing, right? And we want to say, okay, we train with this data. And then when we're done with training our, model, right? We say, model.fit with this training data. Then you want to test it out and see how it performed on that data that it hasn't seen yet, right? Okay. There's a slight issue with this though. Like, it's not really clear at first until you start thinking about iterating and making multiple models. And remember, the whole reason why we split that test set, right, is basically we don't want to influence the model's learning, its training part with data that's not seen before. Okay, why do we want to do that? Like, why we keep this little test set separate?
To prevent overfitting, mostly.
Yeah, right, overfitting. And you can think of overfitting as basically being like, the model's being overconfident. It thinks it knows something that it really doesn't. And so the way analogy I give this is I think of like students, like if you were a teacher and you're giving like, trying to get your students ready for like some standardized test or some, final test at the end of the year, right? You might give them some practice material, right? So like for them to learn and stuff like that. However, if you give them just the test that you're gonna give them at the end of the year and give it to them and study for that, like you don't really know what their true knowledge is, right? Because especially if they know the answers to that test, they're going to basically memorize that test, right? And so what you can kind of think of like your train validation test split is your train set is kind of like the homework, all the different like practice tasks kind of, well, not practice, but like think learning material, right? And then your test set is like the final test at the end to know how well did they actually perform, right? If the student is able to like repeat the same test, like that last test over and over, even if they don't know what the answers directly are, if they know what their score is, like let's say you get a test, you get a test and you turn it in and they give it back, like they give you back the scores, like, oh, you got an 80%. Like the student knows, okay, like I'm missing some stuff, and they try to train from the material again and they get a 90%, right? And so if that test is the same every single time, they might eventually start learning like what are the answers without directly learning what the answers are. Does that make sense? Can you see the analogy? Okay. And that's exactly what the models are doing. So we have this buffer part, or validation, or sometimes called a dev set. And what this is basically, it's a practice test. It's kind of like a quiz or a little practice test that you can test the students with. So you train the students, right, with your practice material. They train, learn from it, and then you give them a validation set and say, hey, okay, let's see how well you do. They don't know the answers to it, but they just apply their knowledge. And that hopefully is data they haven't seen yet, right? They shouldn't see directly at least. And you see how well they perform on it. And in general, your validation, like the performance on the validation is going to be lower, right? Because they haven't seen those directly. They haven't like overfit on top of it. But then what you can do is you can keep reiterating the models. Okay, like that wasn't quite good. Let's adjust the model to see if they can learn in a different way on the same training set. And then you test, well, practice tests on the validation. And you do that over and over and over again. Okay, does that make sense to people? Like that kind of iteration? And so the thing is that validation, you might start getting some overfitting on there, but you'll have some brand new spanking data right here that you haven't touched yet. They haven't touched at all. And they say, okay, I think this model, AKA the student, right? This model does pretty well on this validation set. It's like, I think they're pretty good. I think they're ready for the full final test. And then when you're done with all this stuff, your evaluation is like, all right, let's go ahead and test you out on this actual test set. And that will be most relevant to real world performance now, because they've never seen this before. This is the first time ever training it on there, and you can't iterate on top of the model. And that way, when you're done with your full model, your training, your validation, your iterations over and over and over again, trying to make it better and better, that test set will represent data that it's never seen before. Does that make sense? Like the difference between all those three sets? Give me thumbs up, thumbs down, sideways. Okay, cool. And so to emphasize this is that the reason why we have that test, sometimes called a holdout, where we like literally never show the model at all until like the very end, is to basically represent real life data. Like if you think about it as a data scientist or a machine learning engineer, if you made a model and you train it, right, and you put it out, you say, oh, it does really well on this stuff, and then you put it out in the wild, right? That you don't know what data it's going to see that it hasn't, like, if that makes sense. Like it's going to be completely new data that it hasn't seen yet. And so you want to emulate that before you actually put it out. And that's the idea of having a test set where you don't have it until the very end. And that's going to give you the closest performance of how well that model will actually do outside of your control. Does that make sense? Cool. For the record, when you go what we call deploying a model, has anyone heard about deploying or deployment, something like that? Okay, you might see this as you kind of go deeper into data science and seeing more machine learning. Deployment basically means like, with the real world, but after you test everything, you'll reiterate and get new data and stuff like this. And new data, that test set is going to be old. Like once you used it once, essentially, it's been tainted kind of, right? So eventually what will end up happening, you take that testing data, put it as part of the training and validation sets now, and then you'll get new test set, which is new data that's generated. And the idea there is to just double check that your model is still being consistent over time. So basically we talk about like model decay, where models do perform worse and worse and worse over time because there's just data that it hasn't seen before, or the data slightly changes. Like think of like users, like if you're doing some user prediction, users are going to change their habits and the way they interact with your website over time. Okay. Does that make sense to people? Cool. And I spent some extra time on that because I think it's super important, and it's like subtle and it's a little confusing. But that's kind of the idea with pipelines. We can kind of very carefully control that, like train, validation, and test sets. Okay, cool. Any questions on that? Anything I talked about so far?
So in terms of like the methodology makes sense, but all the tools we've been given is pretty much just train and test set. Is there like a package where people use for the validation part, or is that a lot more? You just keep using the train set over and over and over, or can you explain that real world a little more?
So you guys have like the train test method, right? You're talking about, Michael, right? Yeah. Basically what people tend to do is they have to basically split your train tests well, okay, so they train tests, they'll split it once, which will be all your training data and then your test set. So usually like, let's say about 20, maybe 10%, you know, sometimes in extreme cases, even 5%, it will just be reserved as test data, okay? And then the rest, like let's say 90% of your data is your training set, right? Well, that training set is then split again with the train test split method to get your training and your validation set. That's usually the most common way people will like split up so you get your training, validation, in your test set. There's other methods where you have that full training set and that test holdout and you do cross-validation within here. And that's another strategy you can do where basically, you guys know cross-validation at this point, right? Yeah, so cross-validation basically, right? It's like you basically are just doing multiple models and that's what grid search does, multiple models. This is where you can kind of this weird place where you're like, oh, I'm doing train data and also keeping a validation set and then doing cross-validation on this train set, but also have a validation set separate. You can do that as well. So for example, the grid search will use cross-validation with whatever training data you get, but you might still want to have a validation set to basically be like your practice test, right? It's kind of like saying, okay, once it does its cross-validation and seeing how well it performs, let's see how it does well on this validation set, see how it performs on that. And then usually in like the real world, you can kind of like, and it's going to get kind of complicated, but like you will fold your validation set back into your training, do one last train, and then see how well it does on the test set. Does that make sense?
Victor?
Yeah.
Question, is for grid search, is cross-validation a separate, is it a parameter for grid search or is it a default or?
Yeah, so when we talk about usually for sklearn's grid search CV, right? That's the method. The CV stands for cross-validation. So that's what that part is doing. And so I believe in the actual method, you can say it's like CV equals, and then you can like usually put like 5 or people put 10 or whatever. The CV
It does
stands
have
for
a
how many.
parameter.
Yeah, so you can decide how many cross-validations you have.
Okay.
Makes sense? Yeah, if you put it, I think you can put it to 1. In that case, you just are just doing 1 cross-validation, essentially just making 1 training and 1 validation set. Yeah. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. All right, hope I didn't lose you guys. I'll try to talk about this.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
go ahead.
I'm going to use grid search with cross-validation. I'm still going to do, to proceed that, I'm going to still do the train test split.
That's right. So maybe it helps a little bit if I kind of draw this out, because I know it's kind of confusing when I talk about like these kind of parts. You have your full data set, right? Before the split, you split this off and we just call this is your test set. And right here. And this is the one that you don't use until the very, very end, right? Until you figured out all different models. You can test multiple models at the very end here, but you don't want to use this kind of like until like you're all done with your complete set, right? That's your first part. That's like 10% of your data. Okay, make sense so far? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, and then let's say we split it again into, let's just use blue. We split it again and we have this part now. We'll just say this is another 10%. This would be like your validation set. Okay, and that would be basically the validation set is so what after retraining, we can see how well does it perform on this guy right here. And the reason why you might have this validation is because cross-validation, remember, means that you're basically training, if you do a cross-validation of 5, you have 5 different models trained on 5 different data sets. So if your model takes a long time to train, sometimes cross-validation is just like not practical. Like for example, if you do a neural network, which you guys will learn mod 4, I believe, it takes a long time to train that stuff, and sometimes cross-validation just doesn't make any sense where it's like, hey, this is gonna take so long for us to train 1 model. You can only imagine how long it's gonna take for us to train like 5 or 10 different models of the same thing. So we'll kind of keep this off here, but let's say you do grid search. Your grid search then will take the rest of that data, I'll have this like in yellow. Hopefully these colors are okay for you guys to see. But like what will happen now, I'm trying to visualize this well, is that when you do the grid search, this is all your training set right here. This last section, this is like the last 80%. And essentially what will be like, let's say cross-validation of like 5, right? And I'll just call it like A, B, C, D, E. If you use this as the train set and you pass this into your cross-validation, or so the grid search of like CV equals 5, it'll train with everything like B through E and then validate on A. See how well did it perform on that A part. So there's a little kind of validation set in there. And then it'll do another one like, okay, let me do A, C, D, E for training and then validate on that B set right there. And so the idea there for the cross-validation is you can see how well does the variance change. Like, does it perform like, let's say you do each cross, right? Where you have A is the validation, B is the validation, C is the validation, like the mini validations. You can see, oh, this performed, like, let's say it performed at a 90% accuracy level on validation A, and then a 90% for B, and then 92% for C, but then drop down to like 50% for D, right? And then E performed like 90%. You have an idea then what the variance is if you had randomly selected data. Because remember, this is just kind of randomly selected on like what's the validation. So the idea for cross-validation, you can get the idea of like what the spread is versus like it, because it's random, right? You might just happen to get a good set that performs well. And that's where cross-validation is super useful for. It gives you, it simulates what would happen if you had a different kind of validation. If your model is performing really well on one or two cross-validation sets, but then doesn't perform very well on the other ones, your variance on the accuracy or whatever metric you use is going to be wider, right? Like it's going to be a much larger standard deviation. So that means you're like, oh, my model might not generalize very well for data that's haven't seen. So what ideally you want is a variance that's relatively low. So you're maybe, for example, like maybe it performs only like 85%, but it's like 85, 85, 85, 85, 85. You're like, oh, good. Assuming that it's randomly sampled, that means that your model is going to be pretty consistent in getting an 85% accuracy. But if you had a model that's like 90%, 90%, and then like 50, 60, and then 80, and then 70, it's all over the place. You're like, ooh, like it might perform well, but it might just be chance. So that's kind of the idea why you use cross-validation.
I have a question. So like, is there somewhere where there's like kind of a best practice, how many like separate data points you should have for each percentage? Like, I'm just thinking like, for these projects, we're trying to find like our own data sources. And if I had like just like 1,000 data points and then I'm splitting it 20, and then like, it's just basically like you're using almost no data to train. So then you're not like, I don't know. Is there like a way to rule of thumb?
Yeah, and that's a tough one because basically data is king in machine learning. The more data you have, the better, right? Ideally, usually people will have like 20% saved for like non-training parts. So usually that's like, usually you'll see like an 80-10-10 split, meaning 80% training, 10% validation, 10% test. For very large data sets, you might even see it smaller where you have 90% training, 5% validation, and 5% testing set. This is where it's tough to say like, well, okay, what kind of numbers are we looking at? Like, it's like, oh, if I hit, 2,000 data points, what's my split then? What about 10,000 data points? And it all depends on the variance of the actual data set itself, right? Because if your data is very, very similar to each other, then it probably doesn't matter too much if you have a smaller, training set because it's relatively similar. But if you have data that it's wide variance on like different features and stuff like that in different aspects, you probably want to capture more of your training set so you can get more variance in the different ways it can be trained and learned. Part of this solution is doing something called data augmentation. I don't think you guys have reached that point where data augmentation is talked about. Usually people talk about it in terms of like image recognition, but data augmentation can also just be like, hey, like, let me take a point that's kind of like exists here in this vector space of features. And it's like, what if I had thing that's slightly different? It's not in the data set, but like I could imagine there's a data point that's kind of close to there that's similar. For example, let's say we have like the iris data set, which is like the petal length of like flowers. It's like, oh, we have 1.4 centimeters, 1.7 centimeters, 1.8 centimeters. Like there could be like a 1.55 centimeter in there. Like there's not a reason why there couldn't be. So what if we said, oh, that existed in the data set? And that's kind of data augmentation where we kind of add a little extra like random fuzz. Like, well, this would likely be in the data set. We just don't see it in this one. Those are strategies. It's honestly a really tough thing. It's not an easy question to be like, oh, this is what you do if you have a small amount of data. There's different strategies and stuff. But in general, I would say if you're not sure, an 80-10-10 split usually is pretty standard. 80% your training. If you have very large data sets, and by large, I mean like at least 50,000. When I say large, I'm thinking usually like 100,000. Then you can start thinking of like a 5%, like a 95.5. That's kind of like the and even then, like 100,000, that's dependent on what kind of data it looks like. If the data is varied, like it's varied all over the place, you might actually want to keep still an 80-10-10 split. Cool. Good questions, by the way, guys. Anything else? I know I'm kind of gumping over the like all over the place, like different from like lesson, but like feel free to ask, you know, related questions like this. Okay. I kind of pulled this up right here. This is from SciKit-Learn's actual documentation and talks about, you know, like for example, k-fold cross-validation. So I'm going to send this on the chat too, in case you guys want to take a little read of it. It's a good read. Oops. Sorry, Zoom is blocking one of my little windows. Give me back the window. There we go. All right, so cool. All right, so where are we? Pipelines. You guys cool if I continue on with pipelines? All right, cool. Cool. So hopefully you guys have kind of seen something like this. You guys have seen probably like SciKit-Learn's like pre-processing stuff like standard scalar, imputer. Have you guys seen imputer before? You guys might have like played around with that. Cool. So imputer again like kind of fills in missing values, right? But you can also build your own thing that fills in whatever missing values you want, right? Decomposition, PCA. I don't think you guys have talked about PCA yet, right? So for the record, PCA is an unsupervised learning technique. Basically, it can create new features from the feature set you already given. So you guys will learn about that in Mod 4. And then, of course, you guys know random forest classifier at this point. It's an ensemble method, so we'll talk about that today. But basically, that's the actual classifier. And what this looks like, essentially, is like, okay, like we're just loading the data right now. So I'm taking the iris data set, and just basically you see this train test split. In this case, I'm only doing a train, essentially a train test, but you can think of like train validation set in this case. But remember, this test can be like, or I can think of this test as being like my holdout, and like I'm just going to do one iteration over here. So if you wanted to get specific validation sets, you would then take the train set and make sure you split that one more time. Okay, cool. Makes sense to everyone so far? Cool. All right, so I haven't really done anything yet, but hopefully you guys have seen this part. And then some
quick question. Where I get a little confused is if I'm going to build a model, should I just, what's the best approach? Should you immediately start with the pipeline or go the general route, or that's where I get confused.
Yeah, so one strategy I do is I like to write my code in like an outlined format and say, okay, these are the different steps I have. And I should say, I say code, but I could even be like a markdown cell. So be like, okay, like explore the data, feature extraction, model predict, like training models, model prediction, evaluation. And then I kind of separate it out in that part. And so what you might do is that you say, okay, like I don't know what scalar I want to use particularly. This is where your exploration starts with. So you would probably do a little exploration and see what makes sense. You take notes, right? You might put it down into like, I like to make my notebooks like one big notebook. So I have my exploration, and then like I'm thinking about like my feature extraction and my model stuff underneath there. I might make notes when I get to those sections, or like as I'm exploring, like, oh, use a standard scalar because whatever reason, you know, I might put it something like that. And you might actually try playing around with a little bit, but then when you finally make your full model, you might kind of reorganize your thoughts back into a pipeline. So I think for the most part, especially when you first learn pipelines, this is kind of closer to what you look like, right? Where you have something like, all right, I have like my simple imputer here. In this case, it's using the median strategy, and then basically doing those separate methods itself, and then later on coming back and creating a pipeline to kind of emphasize what you're doing. But you can see here, which is kind of the point I kind of show here, is that it can feel very quickly muddled, and like you kind of lose track of like what each part was doing, or you forget something. So that's why it's kind of useful. Like I like to kind of create my pipeline as I'm kind of doing this process. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's kind of this iterative process. Like we like to talk about like you do like the different steps in data science, like your framework, right? Like think of Awesome or CrispDM. We think of these sometimes like it's like oh, this point and then this point and then this point, like a linear reaction. But it's going to be very much go back and forth where we're kind of reforming things depending on what we see. Does that make sense, David?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. But yeah, it's kind of going a little bit like this looks like. This is probably close to like what you guys like might look something, right? Where you have your standard scalar, you say, okay, random forest. You probably would do this at the end, but like I put it up here just because we know we're going to use a random forest. And then you can see here my X train filled. I might take my X train now and then say, okay, let me go ahead, take the imputer. It's going to fill in those missing values that are there, right? Then I have my X scaled, which basically is going to scale up, you know, after that data has been filled. And you can see it like kind of process like, all right, take this guy, and that's going to be, I'm sorry, we're going to take this guy, that's going to be the next part. X scale is going to be fed into here, which is actually, in this case, reduced. I don't even know what I was doing here. oh, PCA. So I'm doing PCA to create new features essentially. And like basically at the end, having this fit part, right? More or less what your workflow is. It might be longer than this, like, and more spread out, but kind of the idea is there, right? Everyone recognize that? Yeah, cool. And then the thing without this though, well, okay, let's talk about then. It's like, okay, then I actually go ahead and fit it. So this is the actual classifier. This is the thing that takes a long time. And then this might actually be in like a separate cell where like, it's like, okay, I'm gonna fit it here, see how well it performs, right? Or not see how it performs, train it, and then say, okay, let me see how well it performs on the test set or validation. In this case, I just use the test set, assuming like I'm done with the model afterwards. And I would perform here and say, okay, how well did it perform, and make the predictions, okay? And note though, because I'm doing my test set, I have to reapply each of those elements to my test, right? You don't want to apply those first. I mean, you could technically, but it's good practice to separate them out and only do that process over again. The problem is if you try doing, like, for example, imputer transform on this to begin with, that's probably gonna be fine. But if you do something like a standard scalar, then, and you do it on the full data set, not X-train and then X-test separately, and do it on X in general, what's an issue with that if I were to use the standard scalar on like all the data before I split it?
It'll hide maybe some, like, I like to think of it as instability in the data set. So if you're testing the X test data, if it's like way different than your X train data, but you scale and transform everything as though it's part of the original data set, the metrics might be way off.
Right, because remember that standard scalar, and I should say even the imputer, it's based on like that fit transform. It's learning based on what you feed it. For example, in this case, feeding X train and X train filled. It's learning based on what that is. Like, oh, this is how I should scale it. But if you scale it based on the full data set before the test split, you actually are incorporating a little of information into your training data, which can actually, this is called data leakage. Basically, some data that it shouldn't know about yet is being incorporated subtly into that data set. And that's where you have to be a little careful, because that can give surprisingly like different results. And in some cases, you can't rely anymore on that test split because basically the model's already seen it. So that's where you have to essentially, that you can see this dot fit transform versus my transform where I'm doing that test. Yeah. Does that make sense to people? Like that difference here?
So you're going to scale after you train test split.
That's right, yeah. Because ideally that test set is like data that you've never seen before. Like you can imagine the gods hand it down to you and like, you're like, oh, there's test data now. Like here, I'm gonna play with this now because I'm supposed to, versus like knowing what that is in that test set. The less you can look at your test set, probably the better, because it means it's just less influence on your actual trading, and you'll have more reliable and consistent performance on your models. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So you're imputing in two groups, one for the train set and one for the test set.
Kind of. I am like filling in the missing values, right, with this imputer on this X train. So if there's any missing values, it'll fill in the missing values on the X train. But it also learns, well, how does it know what to fill it in with? And I said strategy is equal to median. It's going to take the median of like that feature in X train. Like, what's the median of this X train? Okay, let's say it's 5.0 or whatever. And it's going to fill in 5.0 on all the missing values for that feature in X train. And then on here with the X test, it's just going to transform it. It's already knows, oh, 5.0, I've learned this already. I'm going to apply 5.0 to all the missing values on that feature. Make sense? Yeah. Okay. Thumbs up if that sounds good. Sideways, you're like, I'm still kind of confused. Thumbs down, like, I'm lost. Okay. I think I see mostly thumbs up here. So, all right. But hopefully that kind of gives you ideas. Like this fit transform is going to be something different than just a transform. Okay. And that's why we have to separate these guys out. So just kind of show you guys what that looks like. I'm going to go ahead, just run this guy.
I'm sorry, quickly.
Oh, yeah.
So just,
Yeah,
you're not, okay, so you're doing transform on your X test and you're not doing fit transform.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
You can think of fit as being like teach. I am teaching the imputer what to do. And so you don't want to teach based off the test. You just want it to teach from its training or train from its training. Makes sense? Cool. I could, for the record, fit transform literally just does dot fit and then dot transform. So you could technically split this up to like xtrain filled, or you could say imputer dot fit xtrain, and then xtrain filled equals imputer dot transform xtrain. It's basically just doing two operations. Okay, cool. All right. So that's why we have to separate this out. But once I have this, like, applying all those operations, right? So it's not learning anything from this. It's just saying, oh, whatever I learned previously in this block right here, just do those things. And it's going to do those separately each time, and then finally do a prediction. And we can actually get our prediction in here and get our Y predictions. Okay. But you can see how subtle, like I don't know about you guys, but like it's really easy to accidentally like do a fit transform right here. Like if you just did fit transform and not realize that you did the thing. And that what's going to happen is going to transform the X test, but it's also going to learn from the X test. So really easy to mess up that simple part. Also, you have to remember to put this part in here. This happens all the time where you essentially, you do this X test filled, but instead what you do instead of X test filled, you do like X test here, right? And then you forget this, like, oh shoot, like I actually skipped a step in here. So it's really easy to make mistakes. And this is why, like, and you can, I don't know about you guys, but like usually what code I see when people are starting off is nowhere near this neat. Like it's usually much more broken up in different cells. We have to scroll through, kind of figure out where things are and stuff like this. And you can already see, like, even this being relatively condensed and concise in one spot, it's really easy to mess up very subtly. Okay, does that make sense to people? Like what this looks like? Cool.
But if you do a fit transform on the X test and then you try to make a prediction, aren't you just going to get an error?
Not necessarily. Because remember this fit transform, I'm trying to remember how sklearn works. Well, let's try it out, right? So let's see. We already did a dot fit on here. Let's do a dot fit transform on test field. Works fine. And that's because it's basically relearning from the X test what to do. And so again, it's not going to give you an error and stuff like that, but now you have data leakage in there. Essentially, it's just learning off the test set versus just transforming from the train set. All right, cool. So that's the reason why I'm like, okay, you can do this, but like that's like super messy, like and super easy and prone to errors and accidents, right? With a pipeline, which is this guy. So if you guys have seen pipelines at this point, right? I think hopefully, have you guys played around with this sklearn pipeline? Give me a thumbs up if you had. Okay, cool, maybe some. All right, you can basically import this pipeline and basically say, okay, this pipeline, which is basically an object that we can actually do a dot fit, transforms and all that stuff. You can say, okay, we're gonna do a simple imputer, we're gonna do a standard scaler, we're gonna do a PCA, and then we're gonna actually use the random forest classifier, right, at the very end. And what's nice about that is like I can actually make sure to say, hey, do a dot fit using the X train, which will not just fit on the random forest here, but also fit on all these other parts, the simple imputers, standard scaler, and PCA. It'll only use a training set to learn about, and it'll do that fit right here, which is awesome.
But where does, with the pipeline, where does fit transform fit in? Because I'm going to use the imputer. Is it, it just assumes that you're going to do that, or?
Yeah, so it's kind of cool is that this pipeline actually, when it does a dot fit, it actually knows that when you go from here to here to here, it's passing in the next element in there. So it's like you pass an X train to this simple imputer, and it'll actually do a fit and then a transform, and then pass that transformed X train to the next element, the standard scaler. And it'll basically keep passing the next part. So that's what we call it a pipeline, right? It's kind of like we're passing this train through the pipes, and at each like junction at the pipe, there's like this little box of like, oh, this is the standard scaler. This is like the PCA, method right here, and then going finally into the classifier. So it transforms on the way down. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Yeah, it's subtle too, right? Like if you only did this way, you would not even know that fit transform exists. But essentially it's doing a transform and then passing that element into it. Okay.
Because you're only fitting on X, you're not doing fit transform.
Right, and that's because this dot fit is just doing it once through. I don't have to worry about transforming, because that's what's nice about the pipeline is that I essentially don't have to do a transform because it's implied through the pipeline structure already. Does that make sense? Like it's built in essentially to how pipeline will do a dot fit. When you do a dot fit with pipeline, it actually internally calls dot fit transform for each one as needed. So in a lot of ways, you don't have to worry about transforming. Essentially, this pipeline is your model. So instead of having saying the random forest, like for example, if you notice right here, we don't do a dot fit transform on this model. That doesn't really make sense. Like we'll talk about the elements. Basically, this is an estimator itself. And so we don't actually have to use a transform operation because it doesn't really make sense to do a dot fit and then transform the data on here. It doesn't really make sense for a model, right? And essentially that's what this pipeline is. This pipeline is essentially a model. It's just that it also includes the operations that would include to transform the data. Does that make sense? This is where like, I think like in some ways like sklearn is like super nice, where you don't even have to think about like David, you're doing the exact thing like, wait, why don't I do a fit transform in here? It's like, oh, because pipeline took care of it for you. You don't even have to worry about it. Make sense? Okay. Yeah,
That's
I know.
I didn't understand it the first time around when James brought it up, because I, you know, there aren't really any parameters that you're working with. I mean,
yeah, and this is like, for example, you're talking about parameters like within this part right here. Or
well, I mean, I shouldn't have said parameter, but I'm looking. You know, it is a pipeline. I understand that, but it's like, but I know I'm going to. I'm going to. I have a null issue, so I'm going to impute. But where's my fit transform? And then when I'm going to scale, you know, I mean, it's just doing that automatically for me, I guess.
That's right. And maybe that helps a little bit. Like when I talk about parts of a pipeline, we have these different things: estimators, transformers, predictors. And what's kind of cool is the pipeline ends up being a predictor. So you can't even do a dot. I can even try this real quick. Let's try to do a fit transform. I think it's going to give us an error, but let's see. Yeah. So it's like, hey, this random forest object has no transform. But if I do dot fit, it works fine. And that's because it's actually saying, hey, this is actually a predictor at the very end here. Basically, like, depending if you're an estimator, a transformer, or a predictor, it can do different operations. So we can we can see a little bit about this. And like, this is where sklearn's like actual pipeline documentation. This is why I always like to tell you guys about documentation and stuff like that. Because even though it's like very dense and very intense and like, you know, it's not as like, you know, clean cut for someone else explaining it, it gives you all the information of exactly how this is implemented and how this works. And it basically will go through like all these different parts that like how this works. I do though, to kind of summarize a little bit, basically what's happening is that this pipeline knows what each part does and will apply the proper transformations or fitting as we go through based on if it's an estimator, a transformer, or predictor. And if you get really used to this stuff, you can actually design your own estimators, transformers, predictors, and use that as part of your pipeline. So if you want a transform that this just adds 1 to it, or you know, multiplies it by 10 or whatever you want it to do, you can actually do that. If you want a actual transformer to take your data and split it up into 2 different features, you can actually define that and say, hey, do that stuff. This is where object-oriented programming would be super useful. Those are a little more advanced and honestly not always needed, but you have that flexibility within sklearn's pipeline class. So yeah, hopefully I didn't just like lose you all. They're saying like, oh, you can design your own like estimators and stuff like this. But I think this is kind of what's addressing, hopefully this is kind of what's addressing, David, like you're kind of hold up on this guy with the dot fit versus dot fit transform. It is kind of confusing at first, because if you saw this, you'd probably be like, oh, okay, like that's how it works. Versus like, you're saying, wait a second, how's it knowing do the fit transform? And basically comes down to this pipeline class itself. Yeah. So I know I'm kind of going through. Do you guys want me to kind of keep continuing, like talk about this stuff? I just want to make sure that we're all going in a good direction here. I think I saw nods. Give me a thumbs up if you guys want. Just keep going, right? All right. Tell you what, we can go a little bit longer too if you guys are okay with that, to talk about maybe ensembles and stuff like that too, because I feel kind of bad in talking a whole bunch of pipelines and I realize, well, we haven't talked about the thing that we main thing, but I think it's important. Okay, so I'll move on to estimators. Sound good? So basically, like I said, like the pipeline class, you can basically build it up with these different parts. Basically, they come down to estimator. So an estimator, you can think of it as like an object, like a class, right? That does an estimation. It learns something about the stuff that you give it, right? And so this learning can be really simple. For example, learning the median, but they can also be more complex, like a random forest, which is basically doing up a whole algorithm to learn how to do this operation. So note that basically this estimator has only like essentially one thing, which is dot fit, right? And basically all estimators, the way when you define this estimator, all you need at least is this definition of a dot fit function. As long as you have that, sklearn and pipelines, like, cool, it's an estimator. I'll do whatever you ask for me to do. So that's kind of like what happens here. You can put in other hyperparameters and stuff to tweak the learning process, but every estimator will have a .fit function. Okay. Going off of that, a transformer, right? Basically, you can kind of think of like, oh, it's making a new thing, right? It's taking something and creating something new. Now, a transformer doesn't necessarily have to learn something, right? But we actually do have a fit transform. And the reason why it's like the learning could just be like, oh, do the same exact operation every single time. Or it can be like, oh, based on the data that you were given, this is how you should do it, and then transform it. So transform, I think, is pretty simple. It's like, oh, we take an input, like some value, and then we'll output a new value to the data set, right? Transforming it. This .fit transform, which again, every transformer actually needs, you can actually define this directly, and it's actually using a .fit method. So there are some ways you can do this with object-oriented programming with inheriting fit methods and stuff like this. But the main thing basically knows that when you see a fit transform, think in your mind, oh, it's doing a .fit and then doing a .transform. It's just doing it all at once. Okay, make sense? Any questions? Okay, cool. A .predictor. So when we actually have a predictor class, right? So in this case, it's basically the thing that's going to make the predictions itself. So let's hear it. We would use the fit method to train our predictor and then feed in the new data to make predictions. So note that this is not doing a transform. It's just basically fitting and then making a prediction. So basically the two things it needs to have is a prediction. So as you guess, there's a prediction class and basically says, hey, like this is the prediction. It doesn't necessarily have to have a fit, but usually we think of a predictor with a fit, because otherwise, if your prediction just gives out the same values without ever learning anything, it's kind of useless. So usually we can associate with this a fit method itself. And then there's also a part that's required, which is the score method. And that basically is just so we know it has to have this in order to make a prediction, so it knows what should that score be. You can define it however, but you can think of like mean squared error, you can think cross entropy, you can think of all these different ways to metric that score. Okay. And I know this is a very like washed down version of like if I went to the whole object oriented part and like saying all the different things, but I think it's useful to think about like, okay, we basically have certain things that only do .fits, certain things that basically do transforms and .fit transforms, and certain things that basically just do the fit and prediction. Okay, cool. How are we feeling? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Yeah.
Does it do grid search also? Or?
Yeah, so grid search is one of these things basically. So grid search basically is our predictor here. It's doing a learning from a .fit and then actually doing a prediction at the end. And that's why you actually have a list of scores. If you do like the score or best score, you actually pull that out. And basically that's why we can end grid search. If you could put a grid search instead of random forest, you can actually put grid search on here. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah, cool. I see here. I put a little link here. We won't go over it right now. But has anyone got a whole heard of hands-on machine learning with SciKit-Learn and TensorFlow? This long stinking title. All right, I'm gonna highly recommend. Oh, this is actually the old version too. Get the second edition, which is like it's got a colorful, I don't know, gecko, whatever it is. This book, actually, when I look for it now, book. Let's see it. There we go. This book right here. I don't usually suggest buying books and stuff like that because I don't think it's necessary. I will say this book right here is like if I'm going to recommend one book and be like, oh, someone who already knows a little bit of data science but wants to like learn more about the machine learning and how that works, this book is just amazing. Like it's basically goes through all different. The second edition even includes reinforcement learning, but it has supervised learning, unsupervised learning techniques, some basic feature engineering. And what's really nice that I like about this book in particular is very practical. It tells you, hey, this is what it looks like in the real world, like just so you know. If you're kind of curious and stuff like that, like, you're like, I don't know if I want to buy it. First of all, I suggest it. Like, I don't usually like suggesting books. I swear I'm not sponsored or anything like that. Like, I don't get any kickbacks. But like, I would say like, yes, this book is really, really great. But if you're like, oh, like, let me just see what this looks like, at least like with some of the, like the code, I actually use, he actually has the author here, actually puts in his a GitHub repo where he literally has the chapters. It's not literally reproduce the chapters, but they're the code of that's listed in the chapters and stuff. So for example, this chapter 2 has an end-to-end machine learning project, kind of similar to the, what's it called? The housing project you guys had like early on, if you guys remember that one. It's kind of similar to that one. But basically he goes through cleaning the data through here. You can see there's no like actual description of what's going on. In the book, he actually talks about the whole process and why you're doing certain things. But he basically goes through this whole deal right here, and it's all in Jupyter Notebooks. In fact, you can get on Google Colab. You guys know Google Colab at this point? Thumbs up? No? Okay. Don't worry, I'll show you guys that in a second too. But basically, you can run this notebook, you can clone this repo and actually run this stuff and actually play around with it and see what's going on. It is just so useful. I reference it all the time. And I think it's really great for between like intermediate to maybe more advanced too. If you know the basics of data science, you're going to have a fine time reading through this and you'll learn a whole bunch of stuff. I still read it every once in a while and say, oh, I didn't realize that. So it's one of those things where I think it's a really useful resource. I always get the thick, or not, sorry. I always get like the ebook. And so I always forget like how big these ebooks are. This is like a 600-page book. Like it's a thick book, and it's got a lot of resource of just like different material and stuff like that. So anyway, highly recommend that book. But this part right here in this pipeline, I actually have a little link to the end-to-end machine learning, and you can kind of see a little bit of like what this looks like when they're splitting things up and using pipelines. He uses pipelines really well in this case. Anyway, I thought I'd share that, and I think I'm gonna, let me just send it on the chat too. So this is the book itself, and then this is, I believe, yeah, this is the repo, or the notebook for that repo. So something to check out if you have some time to kind of play around and see what that looks like. Okay, cool. All right, man, I can't believe it's already been an hour. But hopefully you guys find that useful. Any questions about this overall like pipeline usage? I don't know if there. Hopefully I can answer any questions if there are. Pretty good. Okay, how are you feeling? Thumbs up, thumbs down, sideways? Okay, cool. Really quickly, I'll just mention then grid search, because that's kind of like what you'll see most of. You guys know what grid search is, so I'm not going to go through the full details. Just essentially know grid search is essentially just finding different dials and stuff like this. But essentially what it is, you can see this grid search going on right here. Is basically, it's pulling together like the model itself and then says, hey, check out these different parameters. And basically what it's going to do, it's going to at least create one model per each pair of parameters. So when you do a grid search, know that you're basically making, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different models in this case. Like just these parameters will create 6 different models, which can take a long time. And that's even before cross-validation. So one thing you want to do is kind of have a general idea. Usually in grid search, you want to adjust it based on, you want to kind of scale, like essentially like, C equals 1, 10, 50, kind of have that part. And then as you see like how well those models perform, readjusting it down to a different value or a smaller space. You don't generally want to put every single possible value because that can be pretty intense for your computer to actually learn. Let's see here. So yeah, I kind of show a little bit. Yeah.
So the pipeline is going to do grid search for you automatically as a default.
No, not necessarily. So the pipeline I showed earlier, like this one right here. Here we go. This guy right here. This is just training one model with the X train, Y train. It's not doing any grid search. It's just doing that. You can think of the pipeline. I call it pipeline. You can think of that as your model itself. Instead of doing RF classifier, you're doing pipeline. And so on grid search,
if I wanted a grid search, would I include that as one of my parameters on, up ahead in that group?
Yeah, so this is kind of like if you had just, let's say the support vector machines classifier, so this right here, you would just pass that model itself. That's the classifier I want to use. But if you had a whole pipeline like this, right, you can actually pass this whole pipeline into right here. And I put this difference right here because I'll explain this in a second, but like if you have these parts like standard scalar and stuff like this, you want to actually put that in a pipeline and then pass it to grid search. And part of it's because of that data leakage part, because grid search will now run the model, do a dot fit method, and pass all that information down, which is like why I talked about like when we do a dot fit, it basically will do all these operations versus, having to worry about the dot fit transform. It knows like, oh, just do a dot fit and has the pipeline take care of the dot fit transforms. So if you do have anything like that, you want to have a pipeline. So you have that classifier, and then using grid search, basically it's like, you can almost think of it like a wrapper around your whole pipeline or whole model itself. Does that answer
So
your
instead of
question?
logistic regression, you're going to put pipeline.
Exactly.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Instead
And
so pipeline is your model.
Exactly. That's right. You can think of the pipeline is the model itself. It's like, you can think of it like nested in. It's like pipelines encapsulating all these different things, and then your grid search is encapsulating your pipeline, which then is going to be like, now you can think of like your grid search is now your model, which is doing the dot fit here. So it's a little weird, but it does work out in the end. Now, the reason why I point this out is that this right here, this is bad. This is actually leaking information. And this is where it's super subtle, because does anyone see where it's leaking information? Because if you look at this, I think for the most part, people are like, it looks fine. Like, I don't see where we're taking in any test data or validation data and even like learning anything from this. So does anyone see like what's wrong with this part right here? There's a little hint on, I guess, this markdown. Yeah, it's not clear, right? Like, if you're looking at this, you're like, I don't really know. And it's because of this grid search cross-validation. When it's doing that cross-validation, remember, it's taking the data set. In this case, it's taking X-train right here. And it's going to validate across X-train. But guess what? We already transformed everything across X-train. So when we do that cross-validation, we take a subset of X-train, it's already seen the validation set, right, from this scaled data part. And so we're subtly getting a little bit of information here. And that's the power of essentially pipelines, because if you do a pipeline, you don't have to worry about that data leakage going through, because you're just going to do a dot fit internally right here. Like, essentially grid search can do a dot fit within there on its validated cross-validation sets. Okay. So in here,
when we're specifying the parameters, what if one of those parameters appear in 2 of the steps in your pipeline and you just wanted to use it for one?
So in this case, are you saying,
for example, if scalar with mean is in both standard scalar and SVC, just for an example, I'm not saying that it is, but if one of those parameters is in both of those steps in the pipeline, then how does it do the grid search?
Yeah, and that's where this guy right here, like, how do I say this, is this should specify specifically, that's why we name these scalar classifier. You can name them scalar 1, scalar 2, and then specify which one should actually be used. And you can notice that these parameters are a dictionary, and that way grid search knows, oh, basically it looks at that dictionary and says, oh, these are the values associated with each different, what's it called, each different part of the pipeline.
So with those double underscores, you specify that it's for that step.
That's right. And I think, let's hear, grid search, SciKit-Learn. You can see a little bit of this param good. Oops. So you can look a little bit of closer at like what this parameter grid does, and you can see like how this actually is like defined and stuff like this. So you can have like a full pipeline. I think this might not be the best example of it, but you can basically say specifically which part of the pipeline will use these parameters and stuff, which again can be super useful, because let's say you have something of the same name and stuff like that, you want to make sure you name them. So yeah, cool. Yeah, so best way to do grid search, this guy right here, versus this guy right here is actually leaking data, which is like, again, super subtle, but it's slowly happening. Okay. Any questions on anything we talked about, pipeline, grid search? Okay, cool. All right, so tell you what, we are at time. I feel kind of bad, to be honest. We talked a whole bunch about pipelines. Hopefully you guys find it useful though. Would you guys want to stick?
So you highly recommend pipelines and using them?
Yes, because of this versus, right here.
Creating a regular model.
Right, yeah, and I think it's good practice. It's easier to debug. It's easier to add things onto your pipeline. If you get really good at it, you can do really advanced stuff. But the main thing is because of this person right here. Like, this set of code it's super subtle that it's leaking data, but it totally is, which is why you want to avoid this kind of thing. Yeah. Know that pipelines, when I talk about pipelines, like pipelines are a general thing, but there is a pipeline class specific to sklearn. So if you're using sklearn, like strongly suggest using a pipeline and getting used to that. Yeah. Cool. So yeah. All right. So I'm at time, but would you guys want to go a little longer and I talk about ensembles? I see Michael. I see. Give a thumb up. Say no. How about you guys give me a thumb up if you guys?
I gotta
Yes.
run, but
Okay, no problem, Michael. If you guys do have to run, no hard feelings. I'll have it recorded too, so that way you guys can review it if you guys want to. But anyone else, you guys hopefully stick around for maybe 20 more minutes?
I have to go too. Victor,
Okay.
how are the twins?
They're doing great. They're 4 months this week. Yeah, I had some. I had twin girls born. I think Steve, you left right as I took parental leave, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're doing
So
super
I
great
haven't
and
heard from you
healthy.
since then. Cool.
I know.
Congrats.
Yeah, we'll have to catch up. Thank you.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, take care, Steve.